Okay, so here, just give me a second. Okay, so today I have a pretty ambitious goal today. So we are going to look at um, Keynes chapter 17. Okay, so this chapter is called The Essential Properties of Interest and Money. Now keep that title in mind. But before we start, there's a few things we have to understand. Like, interest involves time now. Time is one of the most complex things in physics. It has to do with paths, um, and even gravitation in physics. But in terms of financial system, time is very interesting because of the financial system runs on debt, and debt is sort of a projection of what we're going to do in the future. It's like a force almost. Like um the force of promise, I would almost say. That's what I would call debt. So it's like we're going to do this to this end, and then that inherently creates an expectation for what a certain outcome will be. And so if you want to talk about how the US has a national debt, it only has a debt in the very most abstract sense, that there is this narrative about what the country is and what we hope to achieve with this national, with this system of accounting, with this rule of law, with all these things. So that's what debt is. It's just um, it has to do with time. Um, so in order to, the other thing with time and finance is obviously going to be interest rates. And so you get into a lot of stuff like forward prices and futures contracts, and those are a little bit different. So before you understand chapter 17, it is helpful to talk about what a futures contract is. So, like, first of all, what is a spot price? Oh, I'm typing on the wrong keyboard. I have a couple computers set up just to help me. But so spot price is just going to be what the price of something is right now. Spot price is the current price. I'm reading Investopedia, just their terms. The spot price is the current price in the marketplace at which a given asset can be bought or sold for immediate delivery. Okay, so even the language, like, if you weren't thinking about futures contracts, then you would just say, "Oh, what's the price?" Okay, and it would be implicit that you're talking about the price now. But when you say spot price, it means you're talking about prices within this temporal frame. So here it says basics of spot price. Spot prices are most frequently referenced in relation to the price of commodity futures contracts, such as contracts for oil, wheat, and gold. So right now, I'm actually working in fast food, which is interesting. But um, there are certain menu costs, right? This is a term in economics, the cost to update your menu. Now, given that we have a digital system, it might be just as easy as changing a number in a database. But today, like if a fast food restaurant wants to change their prices, it's going to have a lot of ramifications for customers that expect the stable price and things. So there is a certain schedule on which, like, they'll try to keep the prices the same for a long time. Now, if you're serving hamburgers or Mexican food or Greek food or if you're serving any type of food, there are various ingredients in that food, and the price of each one of those ingredients can change constantly. So, what a lot of these chains want to do is they want to have a price that they can lock in and be profitable for them, and yet be reasonable for customers, so they're competitive. So, a significant buyer and seller of futures contracts are these companies, such as fast food chains, that want that stable price, and so they will lock in these types of contracts. So, for example, if they need potatoes, um, they will buy and sell futures contracts mostly buy, um, for these items so that they can have a stable price for their customers. And then um, they may have to raise their prices, but at least within a certain time frame, they know they can get what they want delivered, and someone else will take on that price risk. And so they don't have to try to guess so much on the price of these commodities every day once they lock in these contracts. And so that's of great benefit for them, and it allows them to very carefully calculate their costs and update them only periodically, which is easier for customers. It's easier for their analysts too, if they can lock in a price for a certain time frame. So this is sort of like the function that future markets play. Like a lot of our perception of the financial system may only be based on like people want to gamble to make money, or people just want to get lucky and like be part of the next Apple or Amazon. So a lot of our perception on the financial system is skewed by this whole mentality, like the very prominent possibility of making a ton of money quickly or easily, which I tend to call an upward price correction. So instead of a return, sometimes I like calling when things really appreciate rapidly, I call that an upward price correction. Not that it's necessarily expected or like the norm. It's just that it was so undervalued, and now we're finally getting to where the true price should be. But anyway, in contrast to that mentality of, oh, you can get really rich if you figure out some secret formula, there is this idea of just being able to have stability and commitment. And that's a lot of the function of futures markets and futures prices. So, yeah, I mean, right now I'm browsing over the Investopedia article on spot price, but let's talk about what a futures contract is specifically, because it's important for these details when we start getting into chapter 17 to know exactly what is going on. Here, I'm just going to post a link. Nah, let's just keep going. Anyway, futures contract is a legal agreement to buy or sell a particular commodity, asset, or security at a predetermined price at a specific time in the future. So this is an important point, and I hope I'm getting this all correct, because if I'm not, that's going to be a little embarrassing. But I don't work in finance, so I have no personal or professional um, embarrassment with regards to this if I get something wrong. But I just want to be correct because I'm trying to create educational material on this, but a futures contract involves a commitment to buy or sell something in the future. So you both receive and pay for something in the future. And so when you do a futures contract, you are going to be concerned about the value of both the thing you're buying and what you're using to pay for it. And so in MMT, like, there's this particular video. Well, I guess Mosler has described this forward prices channel for how the interest rate creates a continuous rate of inflation. And that's based on the carrying costs of having, if you want to sell something in the future and buy something now, store it, and then have it ready to deliver in the future, then you lose the time value of money or the interest income you could have earned over that time. So in order to write that contract, you have to discount, or rather, you have to increase the price of a future delivery of a good based on the fact that you have to spend the money now to store the item. If you just want a very predictable way to do it, if you just want to silo the commodity and then deliver it. Now, obviously, I mean, even in that video, I'll link to it in a comment, but Mosler talks about, hey, for perishables, it may be a little different, but if the price of non-perishables follows this trajectory, then perishables would you'd expect the relative price structure to bear some similarity. So that's the important part of futures contracts. You have to remember that it's an agreement to both deliver the good and deliver the money in the future. Now, if we wanted to pay now to receive something in the future, that would, I don't know what this is called, whether it's a layaway or anyway. So bear in mind what a futures contract is, and now we're going to get into reading chapter 17. So let's see. I'm going to make myself a little smaller here. You know what? Let's just do this. Okay, chapter 17, the essential properties of interest and money. Okay, it seems then that the rate of interest on money plays a peculiar part in setting a limit to the level of employment. So already in the first line of this chapter, it's like, okay, interest rates and employment are connected. They have a certain relation. And, or at least that's the logic. But let's keep going. It seems then that the rate of interest on money plays a peculiar part in setting a limit to the level of employment, since it sets a standard to which the marginal efficiency of a capital asset must attain if it is to be newly produced. Okay, so one thing about reading technical materials, like when you're reading mathematics, there's no set time frame for reading a certain amount of mathematical text. It's just however long it takes you to figure out the author's frame of mind and intention and meaning. So you could spend 100 hours on one line of text when reading mathematics. Now, I don't think it's as bad in this kind of thing, but you shouldn't just try to read this material straight through it. And sometimes the other thing is, like, most of the when you're working on this technical material, most of it you'll just fly right through, and then there'll just be like one line where that's the sticking point, and you have to spend like 100 hours on that line. So this is how you have to learn to read technical material. Like, most of it you're just like, yeah, know that, check, check, check. It's like a checklist until you can get to the spot, and then it's like you're climbing a mountain. Okay? So that's sort of how some of this technical material is, we're going to try to take it at a slow, even pace. Because I think this is approachable, but just keep that in mind that if you're studying and reading this stuff on your own, don't put pressure on. It's not like watching a movie or something like that. It's the time you need to take to get through something is however long it needs to be. So you got to give yourself that time with technical material. That's so. Right now we're sort of sticking on the first line, I guess. The rate of interest on money sets a standard to which the marginal efficiency of a capital asset must attain if it is to be newly produced. So, the goal of capitalism, right, is to buy assets that you can use to make more assets. Now, I would describe it as capital is that which increases the productivity of labor. But you can abstract that away. So you can just think of capital as a good with a price, and you can use those goods to generate things with higher price. So by having an interest rate, a certain rate of interest, if you're able to borrow more money, then you can hire more people. You can hire you can deploy any resource basically that has a price to develop more. So, if the interest rate is too high, then you can't afford to borrow and employ people or any type of resource to generate goods and services. So, I mean, this is also the conventional understanding today within our capitalist society that interest is a magical force of nature almost. And so, I don't want to sort of give too many spoilers or bias you too much, but some of this stuff, a lot of Keynes's writing, he's trying to work with common foundation to argue with people. Now, so you shouldn't necessarily take everything as the most literal and direct exposition of his viewpoint. He is making certain arguments for a certain audience. And the key to reading any work is to understand the audience. Now, this, I'm just going to look up real quick how many chapters in Keynes that there are. General theory of employment, interest, and money. Okay, so that's the title of the work, and the title of this chapter is the essential properties of interest and money. Okay, so another thing that's I want to see like how many chapters. So it looks like there's like 20 something chapters. Here, let's just pull up the PDF. Okay, there's 24 chapters. So chapter 17 is right at that 2/3 spot. Let's see. So if we do, I don't know, my math isn't working right now in my head. So 24 times 2 divided by 3 equals 16. So 23rd or 17, chapter 17 is pretty much right at that 2/3 spot where in most creative works you're going to be right at the pinnacle of it. So if you talk to modern economists saying like, oh, you can just throw out chapter 17, you can just ignore it in Keynes's work, well, it's at the apex point of the book, and the title of the chapter is basically a reiteration of the title of the book itself. So the name of Keynes's work is The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And then this chapter is the essential properties of interest and money. And then in the first title, the first sentence of the chapter, it discusses employment, okay? So this is his argument. This is like the centerpiece of the whole book. He's saying interest in money defines employment. Okay, so this is the argument. So yeah. So after once you have that context, and remember again, Keynes isn't necessarily his writing isn't always a direct exposition of his viewpoint. It's not like people back then were a lot better at persuasive writing because generally when someone would buy your book, they would probably read it with like in pre-internet days. Like they would probably take the time to read it. So style is a little different, and writing back then was generally a little bit more leisurely in getting to your conclusion. Um, so you have to read this critically and being like, the most important part of critical reading is understanding the audience that the author is talking to, because that's going to define everything he says. So this is Keynes's work that he wanted to address to the economists of the time. And this is the chapter I was tying it all together. And so essentially, he might as well be writing it today for today's economists because it's the same issue. Like a lot of Keynes's ideas were adopted, but then they regressed because people didn't bother really understanding chapter 17 here. So now that we understand the context, trying to understand the author's intent, now we have to get to the technical issue of futures contracts. So let's keep reading here. That this should be so is at first sight most perplexing. It is natural to inquire wherein the peculiarity of money lies as distinct from other assets, whether it is only money which has a rate of interest, and what would happen in the non-monetary economy. Until we have answered these questions, the full significance of our theory will not be clear. Again, this sounds a lot like MMT, like money matters. Like the ability to create money, whether by banks or by governments, or if corporate entities can do that, that matters to an economy and it affects employment. But this chapter is trying to tie that into a more conventional view of capitalism as, oh, assets with a price generate more assets with prices, which has a certain amount of utility to it, this framework, but it does hide and obfuscate certain things like the worker. Like when you talk about capital, when you take a capital view of the economy, the the labor is like only it's like any other resource, so it sort of becomes a background aspect. Um, so in this first paragraph, Keynes is like saying, okay, money affects employment, but why does money have a rate of interest? And lots of things can have a rate of interest. So that's what he's arguing in this chapter. The money rate of interest, we may remind the reader, is nothing more than a percentage excess of a sum of money contracted for delivery, e.g., a year hence, over what we may call the spot or cash price of the sum thus contracted for forward delivery. So this is a really confusing sentence. For one thing, he's trying to describe a loan contract as if it's a futures contract. Okay? Which, with a loan, you're borrowing money and you're repaying money. But in a futures contract, you agree to buy something in the future. So they're sort of different financial constructs, but you can collate the different ideas, I guess you would say, or correspond them. I guess correspond is probably a better word here. You can correspond these different financial arrangements to compare them, and that's what Keynes is doing here. It would therefore seem that for every kind of capital asset there must be an analog of the rate of interest on money. For there is a definite quantity of wheat to be delivered a year hence, which has the same exchange value today as 1,000 quarters wheat for spot delivery. So, if we want to sell wheat today, how much wheat today could buy? Let's try to simplify a little. This is really the important part of the book. So let's just do apples. I like apples. So if we want to buy 100 apples next, what day of the week is it? It's Saturday. How many apples would we have to sell today to buy 100 apples in 1 week? Now, if the price of apples is going to go down, then we can buy more apples. We could sell 100 apples today and buy even more apples in 1 week if the price of apples is going down. If the price of apples is going up, and you also have to factor in the rate of interest. So if you sell 100 apples today and you earn 10% interest, then you could buy, and the price of apples doesn't change, then you could buy 110 apples in a week. But if you earn interest and the price of apples goes down, you could earn even more. So the whole point of this is basically saying that the interest rate on one asset, if we pretended that asset was money, so it's sort of like trying to they say in economics, ignore money. This is sort of like trying to be more specific about that. Okay, we're going to pretend wheat is money. We're going to pretend apples are money. So if you borrowed 100 apples today, how many apples would you have to deliver in the future? Now, this depends both on the rate of interest on money and on the change in the price of apples. And that's not even talking about financial uncertainty. The difference between the future and spot contracts for a commodity such as wheat, which are quoted in the market, bears a definite relation to the wheat rate of interest. But since the future contract is quoted in terms of money for forward delivery and not in terms of wheat for spot delivery, so I have to just totally admire Keynes because he's taking a simple idea, which is a loan, that we're all familiar with, and I guess it's not necessarily so simple, but it's a very familiar idea for most people, the idea of a loan paying back with interest. And he's comparing it to a futures contract, which is probably less familiar to people. Like the idea of doing futures contracts, because most people don't have to try to lock in prices and stuff. They aren't those kinds of businesses that I mentioned earlier that need really stable prices. So he's trying to take this familiar idea and explain it by comparing it to a complicated, less familiar idea. So he's trying to compare loan interest to a futures contract. And so he ends up describing the simple idea in complicated terms. And so it's like you have to understand this simple idea of borrowing money at interest in terms of a futures contract. And so I would advise you, again, like I was saying earlier, you have to take as much time as you may need reading some of this stuff. Okay, so I am just going to let you, if you want to go back and read some of this on your own, that you can do that. But it follows from this that there's no reason why the rates of interest should be the same for different commodities, why the wheat rate of interest should be equal to the copper rate of interest. For the relation between spot and futures contracts as quoted in the market is notoriously different for different commodities. Just as I was saying before, both the interest you earn and the price of money will affect that. This we shall find will lead us to the clue we are seeking, for it may be that the greatest of the own rates of interest, as we may call them, which rules the roost. This is funny because he's saying it may be, but this is sort of the conventional wisdom that capital always invests in the most profitable thing. And I think Keynes is sort of criticizing that, saying we have a system with unemployment, so we're wasting people's lives, the only real resource that matters. So maybe we aren't so good at investing. Maybe this whole money capital abstraction and like using money to generate more money isn't serving us. But he's like, it's like if you've read A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, he talks in that work, he creates this completely absurd idea and talks about it favorably. So in this case, he's like, oh, it may be that there's some optimal way to allocate capital, and that determines the actual interest rate. And it's like, well, that's what people think. Like, that's the conventional view. Like, even in Keynes's time, that's the way people thought about investing. So he's acting like this is a clever new idea, but it's almost like to satirize it, like saying, oh, I just thought of this, like trying to make you think, hey, maybe it's not so great after all. It may, okay. And that there are reasons why it is the money rate of interest which is often the greatest, because, as we shall find, certain forces which operate to reduce their own rates of interest to other assets do not operate in the case of money. So it's like, oh, money is so great because it always has the highest interest rate, and that determines how we optimally allocate resources. But if you actually get through the chapter and see where we're going with this, it's like, well, maybe that's not great. Maybe that's where all the bad stuff comes from that we associate with the monetary economy, that we think of natural cycles like recessions. That's a hint, that's a spoiler. Anyway, let's keep going. Now, each of these commodity standards offers us the same. So it's like this is more of, we could treat anything as money, we could treat wheat as money, and we would just have to convert the units as if we were doing a foreign exchange conversion, which in practice can be very complicated in terms of calculation, but in principle, conceptually it's straightforward. You just convert from one unit to the other, but the calculation is, you have to do it, right? Okay. There were some composite commodity which could be regarded, strictly speaking, as representative. We could regard the rate of interest and the marginal efficiency of capital in terms of this commodity as being, in a sense, uniquely the rate of interest and the marginal efficiency of capital. So, like, again, this idea that capital is the ultimate measure of all things, that capitalism is the ultimate system, guys. But there are, of course, the same obstacles in the way of this as there are. He's like trying to like talk favorably in forms of capital, but he's like, "Oh, capitalism is so great." Oh, but he's like talking as if it's a new idea, and he's like, "I'm so excited about this idea," so like people will relate to it. But then he's like, "But on the other hand, it doesn't really work." Anyway, so far, therefore, the money rate of interest has no uniqueness compared to other rates of interest, but is on precisely the same footing. Wherein, then, lies the peculiarity of the money rate of interest, which gives it the predominating practical importance attributed to it in the preceding chapters? Why should the volume of output and employment be more intimately bound with the money rate of interest than with the wheat rate of interest or the house rate of interest? So again, like, I have to reiterate this in terms of composition, Keynes is making it clear. He's dropping all the hints that this is the most important part of the book. Like, he's tying it back into everything he said in previous chapters, and I'm sure in other chapters he'll just like sort of wind down that. It's the exact same as you'd see in like a movie or book or any work where you have sort of a build up. But let's keep going. Let us consider what the various commodity rates of interest over a period of, say, a year are likely to be for different types of assets. So again, this is more technical stuff. You can go through it. He starts assigning variables. Some assets produce a yield or output Q measured in terms of themselves. By assisting some processes, production or supplying services to a consumer, most assets except money suffer some wastage or involve some costs through the mere passage of time. Now, all this is important. Me skipping over this isn't to say this isn't important, but there's all these variables like carrying costs, and the first one was yield. So, like, again, this is the conventional capitalist view. And then he does liquidity premiums. Now, all this is meaningful, but it's almost like the means to the end, right? So he's almost satirizing this as much as he's promoting it, you know? Now, those assets of which the normal supply price is less than the demand price will be newly produced. These will be those assets of... So, again, if you try to take this 100% seriously, it's going to be a very hard chapter to read. You have to understand this chapter as Keynes talking to a very pretentious audience of economists, which economists are, if you've ever met them. Even the good ones end up being pretentious unintentionally. Like, it's like I've spent a lot of time computer programming, and the very word pretense is like they'll just assume you have the same interest and aptitudes as they do. Just because they're so excited to talk with someone who about their ideas. And so like I would talk to like cousins of mine and friends about this kind of stuff, and it's always so hard to talk about computer programming because it's a very personal experience with the machine. It's just very abstract. And so in a conversation, it's very hard to represent that. But I remember first hearing about object relational mappers and stuff with my cousin, and I internalized it, but I didn't understand what he had been saying until like 2 or 3 years later. Like, I don't know why that happens, but I'll just remember enough to like know what he was talking about, and then not understand it until a few years later. I'll be like, oh, that's what they were talking about. It's just weird. But everyone's different, and again, pretentious, right? Meaning you just assume what the other party's thinking. So that's how we have to understand Keynes. He's talking to a very pretentious crowd here of economists. And so he's using their formal technical language as much as possible, and he's not trying to jump the gun to the conclusion, because once they hear that conclusion, their brains shut off, okay? Until then, they'll take him seriously, but we'll get to the conclusion. We'll just skim over this technical stuff. Okay, in attributing, therefore, a peculiar significance to the money rate of interest, we have been tacitly assuming the kind of money which we are accustomed to has some special characteristics which leads to its own rate of interest in terms of itself as a standard being more reluctant to fall as output increases than the own rates of interest of any other asset in terms of themselves. Like, is that not one of the most pretentious lines of text ever written? It's not that complicated, but it combines many ideas from a different perspective. Just as I was explaining earlier, how Keynes was explaining simple loans in terms of the more or less familiar idea of futures contracts, where many of us may be familiar with borrowing money and then repaying it with interest, whereas a futures contract may be more complicated or less familiar. He's explaining these things in a very complicated way. So don't worry too much about that, but reflection shows, I think, that the following peculiarities, which commonly characterize money as we know it, are capable of justifying it. To the extent that the established standard of value has these peculiarities, the summary statement that it is the money rate of interest, which is the significant rate of interest, will hold good. Money has, both in the short and long period, a zero, or at least at any rate, a very small elasticity of production so far as the power of private enterprise is concerned. So here he draws a very important distinction between the public powers and private enterprise. And he's like, yeah, no one can make money except as long as that no one is the private market, okay? So again, he's saying everything in a very roundabout way. He doesn't come out and say, oh, government can make as much money as it wants. He says, nobody can make money as long as that nobody is the private sector. Money, that is to say, cannot be readily produced. Labor cannot be turned on at will by entrepreneurs to produce money in increasing quantities as its price rises in terms of the wage unit. So again, the simple act of money creation is being compared to the entrepreneurial or capital process. So whenever, let's say, houses became more expensive, well, then the idea is the market would allocate more people to produce houses. If plumbing services become expensive, the idea is more people would become plumbers, and then you would allocate that. But the idea of money that he's presenting here, if we look at money from that entrepreneurial view, when money becomes more expensive, you can't just go out and produce more of it. So its interest rate will rise, is what he's saying. I don't know if at the end of the day if that's going to be the same conclusion, but at least for the sake of argument from this perspective, which is the conventional capitalist view, he's adopting that view for the sake of his argument. Now, in the case, again, in a capitalist society, production gets diverted to the higher priced things. Thus, the characteristic that money cannot be readily produced by labor gives at once some prima facie presumption for the view that its own rate of interest will be relatively reluctant to fall. Whereas, okay, this is the most important line of the chapter, in my opinion. So, economists spend a lot of time talking about recessions, depressions, price runs on banks, stuff like this. Like, this is the whole thing they're obsessed with. So, but he, in this chapter, almost as a throwaway statement, it's like, well, if we could produce money like a motor car and grow it like wheat, if money grew on trees, we wouldn't have any problems, brothers. That's what Keynes is saying here. It's just such a throwaway statement, but it like solves the entire problems of the field. It like there's no other way to interpret this than as satirical. Like just how casual he is in this statement. Okay? Now again, back in the day, people would take with their rhetorical styles, they would take a lot longer to get to a point because the assumption was you would actually read. Whereas today it's like in your face. People would take much more roundabout. That's why you have these long sentences. But yeah. So right here in the middle of chapter 17, he's like, "Hey, we can end all depressions. Depressions can be avoided or mitigated simply by if labor could be diverted into producing money." And then he goes on, and here's some Marxist stuff. Obviously, however, the above condition is satisfied not only by money, but by all pure rent factors, the production of which is completely inelastic. So then he's like, hey, like, you know how I said money was the hardest thing to produce, that no one can make money? Well, that's actually true of anything where someone has a where one party has a monopoly and they completely control the price itself. So, like, then the market cannot produce that thing. So any pure rent factor, as he calls it, is just going to be a tax on society by a private entity. The second differential of money is that it has an elasticity of substitution equal or near zero. So he's saying this is just that when money becomes more valuable, people want to use more money, whereas if the price of wheat rose, people would use less wheat. But when money becomes more valuable, people want to use more of it. Okay, simple enough there. Not only is it impossible to turn more labor onto producing money when its labor price rises, but money is a bottomless sink for purchasing power. Desire to save can be unbounded. That's all he's saying, which is Mosler. Straight Mosler. Like, even though Mosler came after, it's the same idea. Like, the deficit is just determined by the private sector's desire to save, which can be arbitrarily high. And this is, in general, this is a feature of mark-to-market accounting. Like, the value of something is just how much people are willing to hold it. Like, the value of Bitcoin is everyone who holds Bitcoin could sell it at the current bid and receive that value of goods and services. And it's the same with money. Like, it's just desire to save. The feature about Bitcoin is it's permissionless. It's not a claim on anything. It's just a claim on itself. Whereas with public money, it is at least used for paying taxes. And for now, that's what we'll talk about with that. The only qualification to this arises when the rise in the value of money leads to uncertainty. So the only time, like, when money becomes more valuable, people will want more of it unless they think it's a bubble, right? That's all he's saying here. So then he says, so that sentence was sort of the pinnacle. Depressions could be avoided, and all the statements after this are just sort of like little technicalities. So even though labor can produce more money, can more money come into existence? And he says, well, he just talks about liquidity. The reduction of the wage unit will reduce cash from its other uses for the satisfaction of the liquidity. So if you pay people less, then they'll have less cash. So anyway. The stock of money will bear a higher proportion to the total wealth of the community. So, yeah, money will appreciate if you pay people less. It's just, he's talking about the global asset portfolio right now, and the items weight within the global portfolio. He's like, well, if money is appreciated and people save more, then people will have less of it, but they'll have the same because it'll be more valuable. It'll have a larger share of the global wealth portfolio. Anyway, just some stuff. It is not possible to dispute on purely theoretical grounds that this reaction might be capable of allowing an adequate decline Money is okay. Can interest rates compensate for this? He's like, there's no theoretical reason, purely theoretical reason that we should think so, but we have to allow, first of all, for the reactions of a fall in the wage unit on marginal efficiencies of other assets in terms of money, for it is the difference between these and the money rate of interest which we are concerned. Okay, there's more to dig in there, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything. The fact that wages tend to be sticky in terms of money tends to limit the readiness of the wage unit to fall in terms of money. Moreover, if this were not so, this position might be worse rather than better, because if money wages were to fall easily, this might often tend to create an expectation of further fall with an unfavorable reaction on the marginal efficiency of capital. Furthermore, if wages were to be fixed in terms of some other commodity, e.g. wheat, then it is probable that they would continue to be sticky. It is improbable that they would continue to be sticky. It is so, by setting money and wages in terms of money, we can keep the wage level stable. And he's saying, oh, if wages fall, then that's actually bad for a capitalist economy, because then it looks like the capital is going to be worth less if wages are falling, because the whole point of capital is to increase the productivity of labor. And if labor is falling in productivity, then eventually your capital is going to be worth less, because capital is only useful in as much as it makes labor productive. Well, that's my argument, but that's sort of the same idea as what Keynes was explaining here in other terms. But in this connection, the lower negligible carrying cost of money plays an essential carrying cost of money. So you can hold on to money. It's like really lightweight. I mean, people talk about this with regards to Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin would even be better in terms of this, because you can just hold it as digits. But like I said, it's not a claim to anything. It's except itself. But the readiness of the public to increase their stock of money in response to a comparatively small stimulus is due to the advantages of liquidity having no offset to contend with. Okay, so if you're strapped really thin and you could buy a bike, you could buy a food, there's a lot of things you could buy, but you only have enough money to buy one of them, you probably aren't going to buy any of them. That's the truth. You'll just hold on to money, because unless you absolutely have to buy one of those things. That's all he's saying there. In the case of a commodity, however, this, as we see, and for the estimate par excellence, thus those reformers who are looking for a remedy by creating artificial carrying costs for money through the device of requiring legal tender currency to be periodically stamped at a prescribed cost. Okay, so this is funny, because this just shows that negative interest rate policies aren't a new phenomenon. Keynes was talking about negative interest rates in chapter 17. And he's like, hey, we don't need to do this. It's just stupid. It's just silly. There's no reason to have people to come by and keep having to get their money stamped. Like, so negative interest rate policies existed, like a tax on money. That's basically what it is. The significance of the money rate of interest arises therefore out of the combination of characteristics stacked through the working of the liquidity motive. This rare rate of interest may be somewhat unresponsive to a change in the proportion of quantity of money bears to other forms of wealth measured in money, and the money has or may have zero and negligible elasticities both of production and of substitution. Okay, these are all details he's covered, but he's like summarizing it in like one very cumulative statement. So we covered all those details already. From an increase in the quantity of money, which is formally the same thing, arise the value of money, which enables a given quantity to provide Increase money services. Thus, the rise in the money rate of interest retards the output of all objects of which the production is elastic, without being capable of stimulating the output of money. So that's just a depression. So when you have depression, everything gets produced less, but money doesn't get produced more. The money rate of interest, by setting pace for all the commodity rates of interest, holds back investment in the production of these commodities without being capable of stimulating investment for the production of money, which by hypothesis cannot be produced. Moreover, owing to the elasticity and demand for liquid cash in terms of debts, a small change in the conditions of governing this demand may not much alter the money rate of interest, whilst, apart from official action, it is also impracticable owing to the inelasticity of the production of money for natural forces to bring the money rate of interest down by affecting the supply side. In the case of an ordinary commodity, the inelasticity of the demand for liquid stocks of it would enable small changes on the demand side to bring its rate of interest up or down with a rush, whilst the elasticity of its supply would also tend to prevent a high premium on the spot over forward delivery. Thus, with other commodities left to themselves, natural forces, i.e. the ordinary forces of market, would tend to bring their rate of interest down until the emergence of full employment had brought about for commodities generally the inelasticity of supply which we have postulated as normal characteristic of money. Thus, in the absence of money, and in the absence, we must of course also suppose, of any other commodity with assumed characteristics of money, the rates of interest would only reach equilibrium when there is full employment. Unemployment there develops, that is to say, because people want the moon. Man cannot be employed when the object of desire, i.e. money, is something which cannot be produced, and the demand for which cannot be readily choked off. There's no remedy but to persuade the public that green cheese is practically the same thing, and to have a green cheese factory, i.e. a central bank under public control. Okay. Again, does this sound at all like MMT at this point? A green cheese factory, i.e. a central bank under public control. It is interesting to notice that the characteristic which has been traditionally supposed to render gold especially suitable for use as a standard of value, namely its inelasticity of supply, turns out to be precisely the characteristic which is at the bottom of the trouble. Damn, Keynes. Damn, Keynes, you said it. Our conclusion can be stated as the most general form, taking the propensity to consume as given, as follows. No further increase in the rate of investment is possible when the greatest amount amongst the own rates of own interest of all available assets is equal to the greatest amongst the marginal efficiencies of all assets, measured in terms of the asset whose own rate of it. Okay, again, this all sounds very complicated, but the idea is the capital abstraction isn't good at allocating resources because, like, capital exists to make labor more productive. So if you're just trying to maximize capital, then you'll lose sight of labor, which is what you care about. Like capital only has value by increasing the productivity of labor. It's literally labor saving. So if you want to generate food with less labor, you invest in capital, and then at a certain point, that capital asset will reduce the total cost of producing the good. So there's a famous XKCD comic about this. Let's see if I can pull it up. XKCD, is it worth the time? Okay, this is what I'm talking about here, guys. This is the whole point of capital investment. Okay, this comic here. How long can you work on making a routine task more efficient before you spend more time than you save across 5 years? This is like the whole point of capitalism. It's to reduce labor. So it shouldn't surprise us that it generates unemployment. But the whole point of working is to produce what we want. Like, so if we're saving labor and then we just leave people to die because we saved labor, it's just bad. But capitalism can actually end up creating more waste and using more labor than it needs if you get investing wrong. So that's what this chart is about, this XKCD comic. So how often, if a test takes 1 second and you do it 50 times a day, so this is over 5 years. Over a 5-year discount window. Oh my gosh. It's so the terminology of capitalism and investment. So over a 5-year time horizon or discounting window, if you do a task 50 times a day and it takes 1 second, then it's worth your time to spend 1 day, or it's worth your time spend 1 day, reducing the time it takes to do a task by 1 second if you do it 50 times a day. So let's say you do a task once a day and you're able to save 30 seconds on that task. It's worth your time to spend 12 hours to reduce that task by 30 seconds. So this is what we mean by the marginal efficiency of capital. It's just this comic here. It's just that chart. It's just like we can save labor time. We can, by creating a tool to help us, by not, like, some animals use tools, but our whole human society, the modern world, is based on the idea of buying and selling tools to each other. It's sort of what capitalism is. So, but what we end up doing all the time is working instead of being like, oh, let's work to get what we want. It's like, let's have as many tools as possible. So anyway, it's just if you just focus on buying and selling the tools, then you end up not being able to track what actual work gets done and needs to be done. Okay? So that's a simple way to explain Keynes chapter 17. And by focusing on the producing the tools and pricing the tools and trading the tools rather than, okay, let's work to get people what they need. I mean, this would even get into Alex Howlett's idea of, or conception of basic income, which he calls consumer monetary theory, and he sort of takes an alternative view to MMT. But anyway, yeah, capital is labor saving. So we're about 3/5 of the way through chapter 17. Lots of details. So, I mean, yeah, at this point, this is technical. This is no longer satirical. But because he's not taking a dismissive tone anymore. That's just my interpretation and opinion. Before, he was like taking such a casual and dismissive tone. But now he's just trying to be thorough in the rest of this chapter. And just trying to, like, check out off all the possibilities and counter arguments and stuff like that. Okay, this is like, as a footnote to the above, liquidity and carrying costs, are these ideas really unique? So very, very detail-oriented, lots of footnotes and discussion of variations and alternatives. Okay. So, he even quotes Safra. I don't know how to pronounce that, but this is an early post-Keynesian, right? Early post-Keynesian here. Born 1898. So he was a contemporary of Keynes. Wow, he lived until 1983. Very interesting. So very fun read. This chapter is a very fun read. Yeah, honestly, like I've just skimmed general theory other than this chapter, so maybe I don't know everything, but that's my view on it now. That could change in 2 weeks or 2 years, or maybe not. But I just thought this was really fun, and thanks for tuning in and checking this out. Good luck out there.